It started with the fog. Not the gentle morning mist that hangs over the bayous, but a thick, pea-soup fog that rolled in off the Pearl River late one October afternoon, swallowing the sound and the light hole that I was down in Slidell, Louisiana, for a weekend fishing trip with my girlfriend, Vanessa. We'd rented a small rickety cabin on the edge of the Honey Island swamp, a place that promised solitude and big catfish. The promise of solitude was the only one it kept. Vanessa was a distraction. Always had been. Even then, with a low ceiling of dread beginning to press down on me, I couldn't stop watching her. She was leaning against the porch railing, her back to the swamp, a sweater hugged tight around her. The fog clung to the loose strands of her dark hair, beating there like tiny pearls. Her jeans were old and soft, worn thin in all the right places, and they clung to her hips in a way that made my throat feel tight. I remember the precise curve of her calf as she shifted her weight, the way her ankle bones looked so delicate above her scuffed leather boots that it was a stupid thing to fixate on, but feared as that. I think that it sharpens some senses and dulls others, makes you latch onto anything familiar, anything that feels good. "It's so quiet, Mark," she said, her voice hushed. "It's not right." She was right. The swamp is never silent. That there's always the buzz of insects, the groan of frogs, the splash of something slipping into the water. But this fog deadened everything. That it was like the world had been wrapped in cotton wool. The only sound was the slow, thick drip of water from the cypress trees. "It's just the weather," I said, trying to sound more convinced than I felt. That I walked over and stood behind her, putting my hands on her waist. Through the soft wool of her sweater, I could feel the warmth of her skin. That I let my thumbs press gently into the small of her back, and I felt her lean into me. Her hair smelled like shampoo and wood smoke. For a second, it was just us, a little island in the silence. Then a sound cut through the fog, so alien and out of place it made us both jump. It was a voice, distant, muffled by the fog, but unmistakably human. A single word, drawn out and questioning. "Hello?" Vanessa spun around, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah. Probably another fisherman. Fog plays tricks with sound." But it didn't sound like a friendly hail. That it was flat, toneless, like a recording. We stood there listening for what felt like 5 minutes. The silence returned, heavier than before. "Let's go inside," Vanessa whispered. "Start a fire." I nodded, my eyes scanning the wall of gray that started just 20 feet from our porch. The tree line had vanished, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of our cabin. As I turned to follow her in, I caught a movement in my peripheral vision. A darker gray shifting in the fog. I froze, squinting. Nothing. Just the swirling, formless mist. My heart was hammering. It was nothing, I told myself. A trick of the light, of an anxious mind. The inside of the cabin was barely an improvement. It was a single room with a kitchenette, a lumpy double bed, and a stone fireplace that smoked more than it burned. The windows were small and grimy, turning the foggy twilight into a premature night. I got a fire going, the crackling of the pine logs a welcome, normal sound. Vanessa poured us 2 fingers of cheap bourbon from the bottle we'd brought. She sat on the hearth, the firelight painting gold highlights on her cheeks and catching the deep brown of her eyes. Her sweater had slipped off one shoulder, revealing the strap of her tank top and a smooth tan line of skin. I stared, feeling a familiar guilty pull of desire. Here we were, hiding from some unseen thing in the fog, and all I could think about was the way her breasts moved under her shirt when she breathed, the shadowed hollow of her collarbone. It felt wrong, inappropriate, but the fear seemed to heighten everything, including that base, animal part of me that just wanted to feel alive. "We should have stayed in New Orleans," she said, taking a sip of her drink. Her lips glistened. "It's one night, Van, the fog will burn off by morning." Another sound. Closer this time. Not a voice, a scrape, like a heavy boot dragging through the wet gravel of our driveway. We both heard it. Vanessa's glass froze halfway to her lips, her eyes locked on mine, full of a silent, terrified question. I held a finger to my lips and stood up slowly, creeping toward the door. My mouth was dry. I peered through the tiny reinforced glass window in the top of the door. Nothing but fog. Then a knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps, not loud, but impossibly firm in the suffocating quiet. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. Vanessa was on her feet now, pressed against the back wall, as far from the door as she could get. I motioned for her to be quiet. I leaned my head against the door, listening. I could hear my own blood pulsing in my ears. And then, beneath that, I heard breathing, slow, wet, labored breathing, right on the other side of the thin wood. "Go away!" I shouted, my fear turning to anger. The breathing stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then the sound of footsteps retreating, crunching slowly on the gravel, fading into the fog. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands were shaking. I turned to Vanessa. "It's gone." "Who was it, Mark?" Her voice was a thin wire of panic. "I don't know. Some drunk, maybe, got lost in the fog." I didn't believe it. The breathing had sounded wrong, gurgly, like there was water in the lungs. We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the old cabin, every pop from the dying fire, sent jolts through us. I held Vanessa close, her body tense against mine. I could feel the rapid beat of her heart through her back. I buried my face in her hair, trying to find comfort in her scent, but my mind kept circling back to the thing outside the door. The silence after the knock had been the worst part, the feeling of being studied. The next morning, the fog was gone. The sun was bright, the sky a hard, clear blue. The swamp had come back to life with a raucous chorus of birds and insects. It felt like a different world. The fear of the night before seemed silly, melodramatic. "See?" I said, stretching on the porch. "Just a bad night. Probably some local kid messing with the city folk." Vanessa wasn't convinced. She was quiet as she made coffee on the camp stove. She kept glancing out the window, her brow furrowed. She was wearing a thin, worn-out t-shirt and a pair of my boxer shorts she'd slept in. The morning light outlined her body through the fabric, and for a moment, the nightmare of last night felt a million miles away. The simple, primal urge to cross the room, lift that t-shirt, and lose myself in her was overwhelming. The contrast was jarring, the bright, normal day and the lingering, greasy fear, all tangled up with this raw need for her. "I want to go into town," she said, not looking at me. "Get some real food. I can't stay cooped up here all day." "Sure." I agreed. A trip to the small town of Pearl River seemed like a good idea. It would get us out of the cabin, normalize things. The drive was short, the road a straight shot through dense, moss-draped forest. The sunlight dappled through the canopy, but the woods felt deep and dark, hiding secrets. We found a diner on the main strip, a place called the Gators Belly, with sticky vinyl booths and the smell of fried food. It was comforting in its mundane normality. We were halfway through greasy burgers when I saw him. He was sitting alone in a booth in the corner. An old man, or at least he looked old. His skin was leathered and deeply tanned, crisscrossed with a web of fine lines. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a stained baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. But it was his hands I noticed first. They were huge, resting on the formica table, covered in thick, silvery scars. They looked less like hands and more like tools that had been used hard for a lifetime. He wasn't eating. He was just sitting there, a cup of coffee steaming, untouched, in front of him, and he was staring right at us. I nudged Vanessa's foot under the table. "Don't look now, but that guy in the corner is staring." Her eyes flickered over, then back to me, wide with a fresh shot of fear. "Oh God, Mark, do you think?" "No," I said too quickly. "It's a small town. We're strangers. People stare." But a cold knot was tightening in my stomach. There was an intensity to his gaze that was anything but casual. It was a flat, appraising stare, like a butcher sizing up a side of beef. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my food, on Vanessa. I watched the way her tongue darted out to catch a spot of ketchup on her lip. I traced the line of her jaw with my eyes, down to the smooth column of her neck. I was trying to use her, to use the sight of her, as a shield against the unease crawling up my spine. It was a selfish, ugly thought, but it was there. If I could just focus on how much I wanted her, maybe I wouldn't have to think about the man with the scarred hands. When I dared another glance, his booth was empty, the coffee cup was still there, full. He'd left without a sound. A wave of relief washed over me, so strong it felt like a physical sensation. "He's gone," I said. Vanessa let out a shaky breath. "Let's just pay and go." We drove back to the cabin in a tense silence. The bright, sunny day now felt deceptive, like a painted backdrop hiding something rotten behind it. When we pulled up the gravel drive, the first thing I saw was the mud. There was a single perfect footprint right in the middle of the porch, directly in front of the door. It was large, much larger than my own boot, and it was fresh, the mud still dark and wet. It wasn't there when we left. Vanessa saw it too. She made a small, choked sound in her throat. Mark? I got out of the car, my heart thudding against my ribs. I approached the prints slowly. It was deep, as if someone had stood there for a long time, leaning their weight on the balls of their feet. I looked around. The ground was soft from the previous day's rain, but there were no other prints. No trail leading to or from the porch. It was as if someone had materialized on our doorstep, stood there and then vanished. It's probably just a hunter, I said, my voice sounding hollow. Maybe checking to see if anyone was home. Without leaving any other footprints? Vanessa's voice was shrill. She was hugging herself, her knuckles white. The sight of her fear should have made me protective, should have galvanized me. Instead, it fed my own. And perversely, as she stood there trembling, the thin fabric of her shirt stretched tight across her chest, I felt a hot, unwelcome stab of arousal. It was a confusing, shameful reaction. Her vulnerability was a turn-on. The danger was a turn-on. I hated myself for it. I cleaned off the porch with a bucket of water, trying to act normal, but the image of that lone, misplaced footprint was burned into my mind. The rest of the day was a write-off. We tried to fish off the small dock, but neither of us had any heart for it. Every rustle in the bushes made us jump. The cry of a heron sounded like a human scream. As evening began to fall, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the dread returned, thicker than the fog had been. We locked the door and shoved a chair under the knob. I checked my phone. No service. We were utterly cut off. That's when the whispering started. At first, it was so faint I thought it was the wind sighing through the cypress knees. But then it grew slightly louder, just on the edge of comprehension. It was coming from outside the window nearest the bed. Vanessa heard it too. She clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What is that?" she breathed. We sat frozen, listening. The whisper was raspy, sibilant, a stream of soft, unintelligible sounds. It didn't seem to be trying to communicate. It was just there. A presence, vocalizing. Then a single word broke through the susurrus, clear and chillingly close. Vanessa. It was my name. My blood ran cold. It was my name, but the voice was all wrong. It was dry and reedy, like the rustling of dead leaves. Vanessa let out a small, terrified whimper and buried her face in my shoulder. I could feel her whole body shaking. The whisper continued, but it had stopped saying my name. It was just that soft, rustling sound again, circling the cabin. I held Vanessa tighter, my own fear a cold stone in my gut. My eyes were fixed on the window. The curtains were drawn, but I felt exposed, watched. In the dark, with her body pressed against mine, the scent of her hair in my nostrils, my mind did a strange, sickening flip. The terror was absolute, but so was the physical reality of her, the curve of her hip under my hand, the warmth of her thigh against my leg. In the midst of the paralyzing fear, a part of me was acutely, shamefully aware of her body. It was a dissonance that made me feel insane. The whispering went on for what felt like an hour before it finally faded away, leaving behind a silence that was somehow worse. We didn't speak. We just sat there in the dark, holding each other, listening to the sound of our own frantic hearts. The next day, we decided to leave. We packed our bags in a frantic, silent hurry, throwing everything into the car without care. The sunny weather felt like a mockery. As I was doing a final check of the cabin, I found it. On the small wooden nightstand, next to the bed where we'd slept, was a Polaroid photograph. It was face down. My hand trembled as I picked it up. The photo was of Vanessa and me, sleeping. It was taken from inside the cabin, standing at the foot of the bed. Our faces were pale in the gloom, our bodies just shapes under the blanket. You could see the fear even in our sleep, the tense lines around my mouth, the way Vanessa had the blanket pulled up to her chin. The photo was grainy, the flash having washed parts of it out, but in the background, just visible in the deep shadow near the door, was a darker shape. A tall, lean silhouette, standing and watching us. I dropped the photo like it was a live coal. My stomach lurched. He'd been in here while we slept. The locked door, the chair, none of it had mattered. He'd been standing there watching us, and we'd never known. I didn't show Vanessa the photo. I shoved it into my pocket, a secret, toxic weight. I just told her I was ready to go. We sped down the gravel road, away from the cabin, away from the swamp that I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a pickup truck following us, or a lone figure standing in the middle of the road, but there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out behind us that we hit the interstate, the hum of the tires a welcome sound of civilization. Vanessa leaned her head against the window and finally fell into an exhausted sleep. The tension began to slowly drain from my shoulders that we were safe. It was over. We stopped for gas about an hour later at a busy truck stop just outside of Baton Rouge. The normality of the place was a bomb. Families getting snacks, truckers fueling up, the blare of country music from a radio that I filled the tank while Vanessa went inside to use the restroom that I leaned against the car, soaking in the mundane sounds, trying to convince myself that the last 2 days had been a bad dream. That's when I saw him again, that he was on the other side of the gas pumps, standing by a beat-up old Ford pickup truck that was caked in mud. It was the same man from the diner. The same scarred hands, the same faded cap, that he wasn't pumping gas, that he was just standing there, leaning against his truck, and he was looking directly at me. Our eyes met across the 20 feet of asphalt. His eyes were a pale, watery blue, utterly devoid of expression. That he didn't smile, didn't frown, that he just held my gaze. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised one of those scarred, monstrous hands and pointed. Not at me, that he pointed at my car, the passenger side window, where Vanessa was still sleeping, her head resting against the glass. A cold deeper than any I'd ever felt seized me. That it wasn't a coincidence that he'd followed us, that he'd known we'd be here. Just then Vanessa came out of the convenience store, holding a bottle of water and a bag of chips. She saw the look on my face and followed my gaze. She saw the man. Her steps faltered, her face went white. The bag of chips slipped from her fingers and scattered on the ground. The man didn't react to her, that he kept his finger pointed, his